And what is the first known physical contact between the Russian and American militaries since the war in Ukraine began? A Russian warplane struck a US surveillance drone over the Black Sea on Tuesday. Now, could this spark a direct confrontation between the two superpowers? Well, for reaction and analysis, I'm joined now by defence editor at The Economist, Shashank Joshi. Shashank, good morning and welcome.
Good morning to you.
Now, first of all, can you take us through the two versions of events, what the Russians are saying and what the Americans are saying?
Sure. Well, what we know is that sometime before sunrise over the Black Sea yesterday, we saw a US MQ-9 Reaper drone, which is a very big drone, not a small, piddling quadcopter. It's a proper fixed-wing aircraft, intercepted by a pair of Russian Sukhoi 27 jets. Now, what the Russians say is that the drone maneuvered sharply after some time and fell into the sea. What the Americans say, I think is a bit more persuasive, is that the two jets tried to intimidate the drone. They flew, maneuvered around it aggressively, conducted close passes, close approaches. They sprayed jet fuel in the path of the drone, presumably to try and obscure the sensors that collect intelligence. That's the point of the mission. And then eventually, on the last of these passes, the drone inadvertently struck, or probably inadvertently struck, the propeller of the Reaper aircraft, causing it to then lose control and force the controllers to glide it down into the Black Sea. I think that sounds like the more plausible account, and certainly the Americans in the past have released videos of these interceptions. They did that in December with a Chinese jet intercepting an American plane, and I think it's only a matter of time before we see the video.
So the question is, who actually knows definitively what happened? I mean, besides the equipment on board the drone, presumably both the Americans and Russians have, if you like, eyes in the sky.
Yes, I mean, people video these things, right? You'll frequently see videos. In fact, you might recall from when we had that Chinese spy balloon, we saw a photograph of the U-2 pilot with a selfie with the drone in the background. And there's cameras in the cockpit. They'll record these interceptions. They'll record the audio. They'll record the video footage. And the drone itself will be recording what's happening around it. That's part of the mission it's on, to collect intelligence. So they'll both have their account. But I think it's extremely unlikely that the US military would have said there was a collision with the propeller if there wasn't a collision with the propeller. I think that, unfortunately, my experience of the last year and longer than that is the Russian government, the Russian state routinely lies, in small lies, big lies about all these kinds of things. And so they just don't have a great reputation of telling the truth on these matters.
Yeah, so the fog of war and propaganda and so on, it's very hard to necessarily penetrate through it. But who's right and who's in the wrong here? I mean, the Russians talk about, quote unquote, their temporary airspace during the war in Ukraine. Does that have any legal status whatsoever?
No, it's like you declaring a temporary driveway around your house and taking in all the neighbouring streets. It's meaningless. It's just it's a claim without legal foundation. And of course, we must be really clear here. The airspace they are claiming is not even theirs. It's off Crimea, which is an occupied part of Ukraine. It's an occupied Ukrainian peninsula taken in 2014, illegally annexed to Russia. So even if there was, an airspace around Crimea, it wouldn't be Russian airspace. It would be Ukrainian airspace. But there's no such thing as this kind of exclusion zone in peacetime. It just doesn't make any sense. Of course, what is happening is that America is collecting lots of intelligence. So are its allies. They fly routinely over the Black Sea. They look for the electronic emissions of Russian military units in Crimea and in Ukraine, other parts of Ukraine. And they try to use that to build up a picture of Russian air defense radars, Russian military forces, where they are, which ones are where, judging by their radio frequencies. And of course, Russia wants to stop that. And interceptions are very common. There's nothing unusual about that. In fact, I think just today we saw RAF and German jets intercept Russian aircraft flying between St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. Those are bombers. So that's very common. There's nothing wrong with shadowing an aircraft and monitoring where it's going. That happens a lot, all the time. What's unusual, very unusual, is a close pass to threaten it. But that does happen. It happens from time to time. What is very, very exceptional and very dangerous and completely unjustifiable is spraying jet fuel over an aircraft of that kind and actually colliding with it. That indicates unsafe, unprofessional behavior. In this case, the Americans say also incompetent behavior. Yeah. And that is extremely unusual and just not warranted by any procedures, laws or norms.
Do you have a view as to how it happened or why it happened, in the sense that was it pilot autonomy? They have general flying instructions as to what they should do, or would this have to go back to the Ministry of Defence in the Kremlin for a decision to intercept?
No, it certainly wouldn't go up to the Kremlin. It's much lower than that. But nor is it just left entirely to the whims of the pilot. We know from previous episodes, there's some very good studies of this by the Rand Corporation, an American think tank, that shows, they've got audio recordings, radio interceptions of, you can hear Russian pilots being told what to do by their ground controller. And they typically escalate up a series of options. And that can be, just approaching closely. It can be dipping their wings to show the weapons underneath their wings. It can be using afterburners to create air turbulence in front of an aircraft, and it can be, in the most extreme cases, achieving a radar lock on the target plane, which is an extremely hostile act at sea or in the air. But you can see the instructions being given by the ground controllers saying, try and get this plane off course, try and stop it from going on this flight path, do what you can. And in that case, and I'm referring to, it was unsuccessful, but you could see them receiving instructions from a ground air controller. In this case, we don't know precisely what's happened, but I think I would emphasize, interceptions are common. That's just not unusual. It's a legitimate thing. So the jets are allowed to fly in the airspace just as much as the American drones are, but it is very, very unusual to actually collide. There's so few examples of that, even through the Cold War.
One could imagine the reaction of America itself, where Russian planes to be, entering American airspace, or the airspace that America kind of regarded as its own, even though legally it might not be, off the coast of the United States, off the coast of Alaska, for instance.
Well, that happens. We see Chinese ships entering these areas occasionally. We certainly see Russian planes entering what we would call an air defense identification zone. That isn't national airspace. It is not, legally your space, but it is a zone where some countries say you must identify yourself. Other countries say, well, sorry, we're not going to do that. That's not legal. We have no obligation to do so. Russian planes do go into the identification zones of European countries. We see frequently, of course, over the British Isles, this occurs very often, and we see RAF Typhoons often intercepting Russian bombers in those zones. But to my knowledge, I've never known, a Typhoon jet or another NATO jet to actually try and collide with a Russian plane, or to spray fuel on it, or even to intimidate it by, achieving a radar lock. That, to me, is not something we do. So I'm wary of even suggesting there is an equivalence between these two sets of actions.
And the Americans, do you think, believe that this was an accident, that it was unprofessional behaviour that had a negative result, possibly for the Russian jet fighter as well, because we don't know what condition it was when it made it to land?
Yes, I mean, from what it appears, they say this was unsafe and unprofessional. That refers to sort of the, getting too close, not being in control of the plane. The word used by other Pentagon officials, one of them called it juvenile, in terms of, the actual act of spraying fuel. And I think above all, though, they do, judging from what I've seen so far and what I've heard officials say, they do think this was not, the collision itself was not intentional. So it was always, the risk of that was there when you behave like this. You're increasing the likelihood it happens. But they did not mean to do it. And the fact that they did strike it shows the plane, they say, not in control and incompetent piloting, which is in some ways, I'm not sure that sounds even more insulting to the Russians than actually saying it was intentional.
So the drone went down. Who will retrieve it? And maybe it'll never be retrieved. Maybe it'll go to the bottom of the ocean. But if it were to be retrieved, would there be anything useful on board? Or do the Americans have a way to destroy anything valuable on board before it might be taken by somebody else?
I don't think they do. In this case, pilots were able to glide it down to the sea rather than just have it sort of plunge out of the sky. But I don't think they will recover it. It's not, the Black Sea is not a very accessible place right now. It's international waters, but this is the important thing, that under the Montreux Convention, which is a very, very old, diplomatic document, the Turks have barred countries who don't have ports in the Black Sea from sending additional warships in there. So that means, you just can't send a US ship right in there. The Ukrainians could send them on, of course, but the Ukrainian Navy is slightly otherwise occupied. And so it's going to be very difficult to get the wreckage. But I don't think there's anything dramatically sensitive. Of course, it depends on the sensors they were carrying. The sensors are the key thing. What sort of radio receivers did it have? What could they pick up? What was their range? But Reapers have gone down in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya. So it's not as if these losses are unprecedented, and it's not as if the Russians will never have seen one of these things before. But I'm personally doubtful even the Russians would probably have the wherewithal to get this very easily.
And finally, in terms of if they did manage to get this stuff, the radio receivers on board and so on, we hear that, these are only reports, but that the Russians are taking any American armaments that they recover, unexploded ordnance and other equipment that the Ukrainians may either have fired at them and they didn't explode, or had to leave behind in their haste to leave an area, and they send them off to Iran to be reverse engineered.
Yes, I mean, reverse engineering is not as easy as it sounds, because, you need specific microchips that may not be available. You need engineering techniques. Even for America to produce new Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, isn't proving very easy, because, you need skilled labor, you need production lines. So it's not as easy as it sounds. But of course, getting your hands on certain bits of this kit, particularly new, novel bits of it that haven't been around for a long time, is very valuable. Stingers were famously used in the Soviet-Afghan war in the 80s, so there's nothing new there. Javelins are a little bit sort of more advanced, but even they are being superseded. But if the Russians or Iranians ever got their hands on, say, switchblade drones that hadn't been used, hadn't exploded or detonated, or Gimler's rounds, the sort of GPS-guided rounds fired from HIMARS, that sort of thing, you can begin to see why it may give insight to the Iranians and the Russians. But it does not mean they can simply produce knockoffs of their own just by staring at these things.
Yeah, it's a bit, though, to reverse engineer something, is particularly something complex, like handing someone a cake that has been
yes,
baked,
exactly.
and say, figure out what went into that. It's not that easy.
Right, yes, exactly. A lot of tacit knowledge is required. But nonetheless, I think what you point to is very important, which is that we are seeing a defense partnership emerge between the Iranians and the Russians. And it used to be, very one way, but the Iranians have turned out to be key suppliers to the Russians. They've given them drones, they could give them missiles, and in exchange, I think that's opening up the aperture of what the Russians may give the Iranians, not just these things you're mentioning, but also Sukhoi 35 jets. Don't forget, their jets are so old. The plane that the Iranians fly is the one that Tom Cruise flew in Top Gun in the 1980s, the Tomcat. So my goodness, they are in need of some new kit.
Shashank, thank you very much for joining us. Shashank Joshi, who is defence editor at The Economist.